August 7th, 1942, the day America decided to stop retreating and start fighting back. In the pre-dawn darkness, thousands of United States Marines crouched in landing craft, churning through the Solomon Sea, their knuckles white against their rifles, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Above them, the tropical stars flickered through breaks in the clouds, indifferent to the violence about to unfold.
These young men.
Most barely old enough to vote were about to become the spearhead of America's first major offensive operation against the Empire of Japan. The target was Guadalcanal, a steaming jungle island in the South Pacific that most Americans had never heard of until that morning. For 8 months since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military machine had rolled across the Pacific like a merciless tide. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Wake Island all had fallen. The rising sun flag flew from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, and America's allies were on their knees. But intelligence officers had discovered something that changed everything. The Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. If completed, enemy bombers would control the sea lanes to Australia, potentially cutting off America's most important ally in the Pacific. The strategic implications were staggering. As military historian Richard Frank noted in his comprehensive work, Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle, this operation represented the first time American forces seized the initiative in the Pacific War. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the invasion fleet, while Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift led the 1st Marine Division. Vandegrift was a Virginia gentleman with steel in his spine, a career officer who had fought Haitian rebels and Chinese bandits. Now he faced his greatest challenge. His division was undertrained, under-equipped, and about to land on hostile shores with insufficient supplies. The Navy promised to support them, but everyone knew the Imperial Japanese Navy lurked somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting. The 1st Marines splashed ashore at Red Beach near the Tenaroo River at 9:13 in the morning. They expected fierce resistance, rushing forward with weapons raised, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Instead, they found coconut groves swaying in the breeze in an eerie silence. The Japanese construction workers and Korean laborers had fled into the jungle, leaving behind half-eaten meals and still-warm cooking fires. It seemed too easy, almost anticlimactic. The Marines pushed inland through the oppressive heat, swatting at mosquitoes the size of nickels, their boots sinking into mud. By nightfall on August 8th, they had captured the unfinished airfield, the prize they had come for. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. They celebrated cautiously, knowing the Japanese would not surrender this strategic position without a fight. What none of them knew, as they dug foxholes in the humid darkness, was that they had just lit the fuse on a 6-month battle of unimaginable savagery. Guadalcanal would become a meat grinder, consuming ships, aircraft, and men in numbers that would shock both nations. The island's jungles would witness brutal combat, desperate naval battles, and acts of courage that would enter the annals of military legend. The campaign starting that morning would determine whether America could fight and win against the seemingly invincible Japanese empire, or whether the Pacific would become a Japanese lake. August 9th, 1942, began with catastrophe. While the Marines consolidated their positions on Guadalcanal, the United States Navy suffered one of its worst defeats in history just offshore. Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had steamed down from Rabaul with a strike force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, intent on destroying the American invasion fleet. He approached through the slot between the islands under cover of darkness, his ships maintaining radio silence, their crews at battle stations. At 1:38 in the morning, Mikawa's force entered what would soon be called Iron Bottom Sound. The American and Australian warships guarding the northern land approach were unprepared despite warnings. Lookouts spotted strange shapes in the darkness, but by then it was too late. Japanese searchlights blazed across the water, illuminating their targets with merciless precision. Seconds later, long lance torpedoes churned through the black water while 8-inch shells screamed overhead. The Battle of Savo Island lasted 32 minutes. When the gun flashes finally ceased and Mikawa's ships disappeared back into the night, for Allied heavy cruisers lay sinking or burning USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died in the darkness, many trapped below decks as their ships went down. The cruiser Quincy's captain, Samuel Moore, died on his bridge, shot through both lungs while trying to con his doomed ship. Survivors clung to debris in shark-infested waters, watching their ships slip beneath the waves with their comrades still inside. Admiral Turner made a grim decision that morning. With his screening force shattered and Japanese carriers potentially nearby, he ordered the transport ships to withdraw immediately, taking with them most of the Marines' supplies, ammunition, and food. General Vandegrift watched the ships steam over the horizon with mounting dread. His 16,000 Marines were now stranded on a hostile island with perhaps 30 days of rations, minimal medical supplies, and no guarantee of reinforcement. The Japanese called their opponents the summer insects and predicted they would be crushed within days. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding Japanese forces in the region, dispatched 900 men under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki to retake the airfield quickly. Ichiki was a decorated veteran of combat in China, supremely confident in his soldiers' fighting spirit. He believed that a nighttime bayonet charge would panic the Americans into surrendering or fleeing into the jungle. On Guadalcanal, the Marines dug deeper foxholes and established defensive positions along the Ailu River, which American maps mistakenly labeled the Tenaru. They worked frantically to complete Henderson Field's runway, knowing that aircraft base there would be their lifeline. Engineers salvaged Japanese construction equipment and worked around the clock despite dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion. The tropical climate was itself and enemy uniforms rotted off men's bodies, boots disintegrated, and wounds festered in the humidity. By mid-August, the first American aircraft landed on Henderson Field's crewed runway 19 Wildcat fighters and 12 Dauntless dive bombers. These planes, nicknamed the Cactus Air Force after Guadalcanal's code name, would prove crucial in the battles to come. Pilots flew multiple missions daily, living in tents, eating captured Japanese rice, and landing on a runway that Japanese warships bombarded nearly every night. According to historical records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, Colossus at Savo Island shocked American military leadership and exposed critical deficiencies in night fighting tactics and radar coordination. The disaster also steeled American resolve. The Marines on Guadalcanal would not be abandoned, regardless of cost. Supply runs by fast destroyers and cruisers, soon nicknamed the Tokyo Express or Rat Run, began bringing reinforcements and supplies under cover of darkness. Each run was a gauntlet through hostile waters, with Japanese submarines, aircraft, and surface ships hunting American vessels constantly. The stage was set for an escalating struggle that would consume both nations' resources and test their will to continue fighting. Neither side could afford to lose Guadalcanal, and neither side would back down. August 21st, 1942, near midnight, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki gathered his 900 soldiers in the jungle east of Henderson Field. They had landed from fast destroyers several days earlier, supremely confident despite being outnumbered. Ichiki had studied intelligence reports suggesting the Americans numbered only 2,000 weak, demoralized troops ready to collapse at the first determined assault. He was catastrophically wrong. The Marines actually numbered over 10,000, and they were dug in, waiting. Ichiki's battle plan reflected Japanese military doctrine of the era, a frontal night assault emphasizing fighting spirit over firepower. His men fixed bayonets and prepared for a banzai charge across the sandbar at the mouth of the Ailu River. They believed their superior warrior ethos would overcome American material advantages. Japanese training emphasized that death in battle was the highest honor, that surrender was unthinkable disgrace. These convictions would prove tragically costly. At 1:30 in the morning, Ichiki's soldiers emerged from the tree line, screaming battle cries, charging directly into Marines from the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines. The defenders had prepared their positions, carefully barbed wire, interlocking fields of fire, and machine guns positioned to sweep the sandbar. When the Japanese attack began, the Marines opened fire with devastating effect. Tracer rounds cut through the darkness like deadly fireflies. The battle became a slaughter. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the killing zone. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red-hot and had to be changed. Riflemen shot until their shoulders were bruised purple from recoil. The sandbar became choked with bodies, but still the Japanese came, driven by orders and indoctrination that forbade retreat. Some soldiers made it across the river, only to be cut down in the Marine positions. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in foxholes and along the perimeter. The fighting was primal in vicious bayonets, rifle butts, knives, and fists. By dawn, the Japanese attack had stalled completely. Marine artillery had joined the battle, dropping high-explosive shells among the Japanese positions in the coconut groves. Colonel Ichiki realized his mistake too. Late he faced not a weak garrison, but a prepared division. His radio operator sent a final message to Rabaul. "We are unable to make assault. Banzai to the Emperor." Then he burned the regimental colors and committed ritual suicide by shooting himself. The Marines counterattacked at dawn, supported by light tanks that had finally been unloaded. The Stuart tanks rolled across the sandbar, crushing Japanese wounded who refused to surrender. It was brutal work. Of Ichiki's 870 soldiers, fewer than 30 survived to be taken prisoner, most of them wounded and unconscious. The rest died fighting or killed themselves rather than face the shame of capture. Marine casualties totaled 44 dead and 75 wounded, a lopsided victory that shocked both sides. Walking the battlefield afterward, Marines found evidence of Japanese expectations, dressed uniforms packed for a victory parade, maps showing routes to Australia, sake bottles for celebration. Instead, they found carnage that would haunt them for decades. Corpses lay in twisted piles, some burned by flamethrowers, others torn apart by artillery. The tropical heat accelerated decomposition, and the stench became overwhelming within hours. The Battle of the Tenaru, as it became known despite the geographical error, shattered Japanese assumptions about American fighting quality. Tokyo's military leadership realized that retaking Guadalcanal would require substantially larger forces. For the Marines, the victory provided a desperately needed morale boost and proved they could defeat Japanese infantry in direct combat. But celebration was muted. Everyone knew this was just the opening round. General von de Grift used the respite to strengthen his defenses and expand the perimeter around Henderson Field. Engineers improved the runway, allowing larger aircraft to land. More supplies trickled in, though never enough. Every Marine lost weight, most suffered from tropical diseases, and everyone lived in constant exhaustion. Sleep came in brief intervals between Japanese naval bombardments, air raids, and infantry probes. The island had become a hellish testing ground where America's resolve would either harden into steel or crack under relentless pressure. September 1st, 1942. The night belonged to the Japanese. As darkness fell over Guadalcanal, American troops braced for what had become a nightly ritual of terror. Somewhere to the north, Japanese destroyers and cruisers raced down the slot at 30 knots. Their decks loaded with troops, supplies, and ammunition. The Americans called these nocturnal supply runs the Tokyo Express, though the Marines had a cruder name, the Rat Run. Whatever the terminology, these high-speed operations allowed Japan to reinforce its troops on Guadalcanal while subjecting Henderson Field to devastating naval bombardments. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka commanded many of these operations with tactical brilliance. His destroyers could make the 500-mile run from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, unload troops and supplies, bombard American positions, and escape back up the slot before dawn brought American aircraft. Tanaka was a professional sailor who understood that command of the sea meant control of Guadalcanal. His destroyers became supply vessels, troop transports, and floating artillery batteries simultaneously. The naval bombardments were psychological warfare as much as military operations. Japanese battleships and cruisers would appear offshore after midnight and pour hundreds of heavy shells into the marine perimeter. The distinctive shriek of incoming 14-inch shells drove men mad with fear. Explosions walked through the coconut groves, detonating fuel dumps, destroying aircraft, and obliterating anything above ground. Marines huddled in foxholes and dugouts, praying their meager overhead cover would protect them from direct hits. The ground shook continuously, and the noise made thought impossible. On the night of October 13th to 14th, Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna delivered the most devastating bombardment of the campaign. For 90 minutes, they fired 918 14-inch shells at Henderson Field. The runway became a cratered moonscape. Aviation gasoline dumps exploded in towering fireballs. Aircraft parked along the strip were blown apart or riddled with shrapnel. When dawn broke, only 42 aircraft of the 90 present the previous evening remained operational. Exhausted ground crews worked frantically to repair the damage, knowing more raids would come. Major General Millard Harmon, commander of Army forces in the South Pacific, sent a sobering assessment to Washington. Can the Marines hold Guadalcanal? The answer is no, not on a shoestring. The situation is critical, according to declassified documents from the National Archives. Military planners in Washington debated abandoning Guadalcanal entirely, fearing it had become an untenable position. Only Admiral Chester Nimitz's and General Douglas MacArthur's insistence on holding the island prevented withdrawal. The Cactus Air Force pilots became legends through sheer endurance. They flew Wildcat fighters and dauntless dive bombers held together with scavenged parts and desperate improvisation. Mechanics cannibalized wrecked aircraft to keep others flying. Pilots flew multiple missions daily on inadequate food and minimal rest, knowing each sortie might be their last. They hunted the Tokyo Express during daylight, attacked Japanese positions supporting ground troops, and intercepted bomber formations from Rabaul. Squadron Commander Major John L. Smith shot down 19 Japanese aircraft before malaria sent him home. His pilots called him Indian Joe and followed him into impossible odds. Marine fighter pilot Captain Marion Carl described missions where pilots took off with fuel tanks nearly empty, hoping to scavenge gasoline from crashed Japanese bombers. Others landed with aircraft so shot full of holes they shouldn't have been able to fly. One pilot landed with 3 feet of his wing missing, having flown back to base through sheer determination. Ground crews painted rising sun symbols on aircraft fuselages. 2 marked "Kill Some Planes" had rows of symbols, like macabre scorecards. Meanwhile, Japanese ground forces built up strength in the jungle beyond the American perimeter. Major General Kyote Kawaguchi arrived with 6,000 fresh troops, planning a coordinated assault from multiple directions. He believed superior Japanese training and fighting spirit would overwhelm the Americans through simultaneous pressure. His soldiers humped heavy equipment through dense jungle, hacking trails with machetes, struggling through swamps and over mountain ridges. Many collapsed from exhaustion, malaria, and dysentery before reaching their attack positions. The Americans knew something was coming, but not when or where. Patrols ventured into the jungle, often disappearing without trace. Japanese snipers tied themselves into treetops and picked off unwary Marines. The jungle itself was enemy territory, suffocating humidity, torrential rains, sucking mud, venomous snakes, and disease-carrying insects. Both sides suffered more casualties from tropical diseases than from combat. Guadalcanal was consuming men and material at an alarming rate, and neither nation knew if they could sustain the effort. September 12, 1942, Colonel Merritt Austin Edson knew his Marines were in for a fight. Intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese assault was imminent. Edson's 1st Raider Battalion held the most vulnerable position, a grassy ridgeline south of Henderson Field that offered a direct approach to the airfield. If the Japanese broke through here, they could capture the runway and doom the entire campaign. Edson, a lean, intense officer nicknamed Red Mike for his hair color, gathered his 800 raiders and paratroopers and told them bluntly, "They're coming for us tonight. They're going to throw everything they have at this ridge." General Kawaguchi's plan was elegant in concept. 3 columns would converge on the Marine perimeter from the south and east simultaneously, overwhelming defenders through coordinated pressure. Kawaguchi believed American troops would panic when attacked from multiple directions at night. His 6,000 soldiers spent days infiltrating through the jungle, guided by Guadalcanal natives sympathetic to Japan or coerced into cooperation. They moved silently through the undergrowth, disciplined and determined, carrying only essential equipment and 3 days' rations. The battle began at 9:30 on the night of September 13th, with Japanese artillery pounding the ridgeline. Then came the infantry, advancing through the darkness with fixed bayonets, screaming to unnerved defenders. The first assaults hit Marine positions with shocking violence. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the ridge as Japanese soldiers penetrated the perimeter. Machine gun fire tore through the darkness. Grenades exploded in blinding flashes. Marines fell back to secondary positions, reorganizing under fire while Edson moved along the line, his calm presence steadying wavering troops. Throughout that endless night, wave after wave of Japanese infantry charged up the ridge. Marine Artillery Forward Observer Major Kenneth Bailey called in fire missions with devastating accuracy, dropping shells within yards of Marine positions to break up Japanese formations. When radio communications failed, Runners sprinted through the darkness carrying fire coordinates, while bullets snapped past their heads. The artillery barrages were so close that shrapnel wounded Marines in their foxholes, but the alternative was being overrun. Around midnight, the Japanese penetrated to within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field before Edson organized a desperate counterattack. He pulled together every available man, clerks, cooks, engineers, anyone who could hold a rifle, and led them forward. The counterattack was more controlled chaos than military maneuver, but it pushed the Japanese back temporarily. Both sides suffered horrific casualties. Dead and wounded lay everywhere. Medics worked frantically in the darkness, unable to distinguish friend from foe except by touch and language. The second night, September 14th, brought renewed assaults even more ferocious than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining reserves at the ridge, determined to break through before dawn. His soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and desperately low on ammunition, but Japanese military culture forbade retreat. They charged repeatedly into Marine fire, dying by the dozens, clawing forward over their own dead. At one point, Japanese soldiers reached Edson's command post, killing several staff officers before being gunned down. Major Bailey's forward observation skills saved the position repeatedly. He adjusted artillery fire with uncanny precision, walking shells back and forth across Japanese assembly areas. When Japanese infantry got too close for artillery, Marine machine gunners fired until their weapons seized from overheating. Ammunition runners crawled forward through fire to resupply gun positions. One 19-year-old private, Anthony Casamento, single-handedly held a gap in the line for 3 hours despite being wounded multiple times, refusing evacuation until the position was secured. By dawn on September 15th, the Japanese assault had collapsed. Kawaguchi's soldiers withdrew into the jungle, having suffered over half their force as casualties. Marine losses totaled 135 killed and 226 wounded, severe but sustainable. The ridge, soon renamed Edson's Ridge in honor of the commander, remained in American hands. Henderson Field was secure. More importantly, the Marines had defeated a coordinated attack by a larger force of veteran Japanese infantry, further demolishing Tokyo's assumptions about American combat effectiveness. The historical significance of this battle cannot be overstated. It's documented in military records from the Marine Corps Historical Division. Edson's Ridge represented a turning point where American forces proved they could not only hold defensive positions, but could defeat determined Japanese assaults through superior coordination of infantry, artillery, and air support. Colonel Edson received the Medal of Honor, one of 4 awarded during the Guadalcanal campaign. In the jungle beyond the ridge, Kawaguchi's survivors staggered back toward the coast, half-starved and demoralized. They had been promised victory, told their spirit would overcome American material advantages. Instead, they found professional soldiers who fought with equal determination, backed by devastating firepower. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese commanders questioned whether fighting spirit alone could defeat the Americans. October 26, 1942, 2 massive carrier forces steamed toward each other northeast of Guadalcanal, preparing for what would become the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. This was the 4th major carrier battle of the Pacific War, and both sides understood its outcome would largely determine Guadalcanal's fate. If the Japanese destroyed American carrier aviation, they could isolate the island and starve out the Marines. If the Americans won, they could maintain air superiority and continue reinforcing their position. Admiral William Halsey had recently assumed command of South Pacific forces, replacing the cautious Admiral Robert Gormley. Halsey was nicknamed Bull for his aggressive temperament, and he brought desperately needed fighting spirit to American operations. His orders to his commanders were characteristically blunt: strike, repeat, strike. The American force centered on carriers USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, supported by 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Against them came 4 Japanese carriers under Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Midway, supported by 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. The battle began at dawn, when opposing scout planes spotted enemy carriers nearly simultaneously. Both sides launched strikes immediately, knowing the side that struck first would likely win. American dive bombers from Enterprise found Japanese carrier Zuiho and crippled her flight deck with a single bomb hit. But the main Japanese Strike Force 64 aircraft found Hornet before American fighters could intercept effectively. Aichi dive bombers screamed down through anti-aircraft fire, their fixed landing gear making them look like mechanical hawks swooping on prey. Hornet disappeared beneath a swarm of attackers. Bombs crashed through her flight deck, exploding deep within the ship. A burning Japanese dive bomber, its pilot already dead or dying, crashed directly into the carrier's island structure, showering the bridge with burning aviation gasoline. Another bomber's wreckage penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar, setting off fires among parked aircraft. Within minutes, America's newest carrier was ablaze and listing, her crew fighting desperately to control damage. The American counterstrike found Japanese carriers Shikaku and Zuikaku. Dive bombers from Enterprise put 4 bombs into Shikaku, wrecking her flight deck and killing dozens of crew. She limped away trailing smoke, out of action for months of repairs. But Japanese carriers had launched a second wave, and these aircraft found the damaged Hornet again. More bomb hits and torpedo strikes sealed the carrier's fate. Destroyers tried to take her under tow, but Japanese submarines lurked nearby. And Admiral Thomas Kinkaid ordered Hornet scuttled, rather than risk losing more ships trying to save her. The Battle of Santa Cruz was technically a Japanese tactical victory. They sank 1 American carrier, damaged another, and destroyed 74 American aircraft, while losing only 99 of their own planes. But strategically, it proved hollow. Japan could not replace her experienced carrier pilots. These veteran aviators, trained before the war in rigorous programs lasting years, were irreplaceable assets. America, with its pilot training programs producing thousands of new aviators monthly, could absorb such losses. Japan could not. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, commanding Enterprise's fighter squadron, described the battle in his after-action report. The Japanese pilots displayed exceptional skill and determination. Many pressed their attacks despite taking lethal damage. We shot down 1 bomber that still managed to release its torpedo before crashing. Our pilots are exhausted, many wounded, and we desperately need replacements. These candid assessments, preserved in naval aviation archives, revealed both respect for enemy capabilities and growing confidence in American ability to prevail through attrition. Back on Guadalcanal, naval battle's outcome meant continued American air support, but at a price that worried planners. With Hornet sunk and Enterprise damaged, the South Pacific area had no operational carriers for critical weeks. Henderson Field became even more vital. It was now the only Allied airbase capable of challenging Japanese naval operations around Guadalcanal. The pressure on the Cactus Air Force intensified accordingly. Through November, both sides reinforced their positions in what became a grinding attritional struggle. The Tokyo Express continued running reinforcements and supplies to Japanese forces despite increasing losses. American destroyer forces, growing bolder and more skilled at night fighting, began intercepting these runs with greater frequency. The waters around Guadalcanal became littered with sunken warships from both nations' cruisers, destroyers, transports earning the area its grim nickname, Iron Bottom Sound. On Guadalcanal itself, Japanese forces prepared for another major offensive. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyokatake personally traveled to the island to command what Tokyo promised would be the final victorious assault. Over 20,000 Japanese troops concentrated in the jungle south of Henderson Field, supplied by submarine and destroyer runs. They hauled heavy artillery through impossible terrain, manhandling guns up ridges and across swamps through sheer determination. American intelligence detected the buildup but couldn't determine precisely when or where the assault would fall. The stage was set for the largest and most desperate ground battle of the Guadalcanal campaign. A confrontation that would test both sides to their absolute limits and determine whether America could maintain its first toehold on the road to Tokyo. October 23, 1942, General Hyakutake Koki issued his final orders for what Japanese planners called the centrifugal offensive. 20,000 Japanese troops would strike the marine perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously, crushing American resistance through overwhelming force. Artillery would soften defenses, infantry would penetrate weak points, and reserves would exploit breakthroughs. Once Henderson Field fell, Japanese engineers would repair the runway within hours. Bombers from Rabaul would land immediately. Hyakutake was so confident of victory that he scheduled a ceremonial parade through the captured airfield for October 26th. What Hyakutake didn't know was that American strength had grown substantially. The Marines had been reinforced by Army infantry from the Americal Division and the 164th Infantry Regiment. American forces now numbered nearly 23,000 combat troops with artillery support that exceeded Japanese capabilities. More importantly, these defenders occupied prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, supported by aircraft from Henderson Field and artillery that had registered coordinates on every likely approach route. The assault began on the night of October 23rd, with Japanese artillery bombarding Marine positions south of the airfield. Then came the infantry, advancing through pitch-black jungle with practiced stealth. The main thrust targeted a section of the perimeter defended by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Puller was already a legendary figure in the corps, a tough, profane officer who led from the front and inspired absolute loyalty in his men. Around midnight, Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle screaming battle cries and firing as they charged. Machine guns and rifles from Puller's battalion opened fire immediately, creating a wall of lead. The jungle undergrowth erupted in muzzle flashes like fireflies in a hurricane. Japanese soldiers fell in waves, but more kept coming, stepping over their dead comrades, determined to break through. Some penetrated the wire obstacles and reached Marine foxholes, where savage hand-to-hand combat erupted. Puller called in artillery support, walking shells progressively closer to his own positions until they were exploding mere yards away. The ground shook continuously. Trees shattered into splinters. The noise was overwhelming. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, artillery, and thousands of men screaming in rage, fear, and pain. Through it all, Puller moved along his lines, his gravelly voice shouting encouragement. "Hold your positions. Make every shot count. They can't take us unless we let them." For 3 nights, October 23rd through 25th, the Japanese threw assault after assault at Puller's sector. Each attack came with fresh troops, yet each was repulsed with heavy casualties. Japanese commanders, operating under orders that prohibited withdrawal, kept feeding men into the killing zone. The jungle approaches became choked with bodies. Medical personnel on both sides worked under impossible conditions, treating wounded by flashlight while bullets snapped overhead. One Marine Sergeant, John Bassellone, became legendary during these battles. Commanding 2 machine gun sections, Bassellone held his position through repeated Japanese assaults, despite being virtually surrounded. When ammunition ran low, he sprinted through enemy fire to bring forward more belts. When one of his guns was destroyed, he personally manned the remaining weapon, firing until the barrel glowed white-hot. His actions helped prevent a breakthrough that could have collapsed the entire sector. Bassellone received the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted Marine so honored in World War II. By October 26th, Hyakutaki's offensive had failed completely. Instead of parading through captured Henderson Field, Japanese commanders counted their losses. Over 3,500 dead, with thousands more wounded. American casualties totaled approximately 86 killed and 192 wounded, another lopsided defensive victory. The disparity reflected superior American artillery, better defensive positions, and the folly of frontal assaults against prepared positions. The failure stunned Japanese military leadership. They had committed their best troops, provided maximum artillery support, and coordinated multi-directional assaults, first thing that doctrine suggested should succeed. Yet American forces had held firm, inflicting devastating casualties while maintaining defensive integrity. As noted in post-war interviews with Japanese officers documented by military historians, this battle shattered confidence in the infantry-centric tactics that had served Japan well in China and Southeast Asia. In Tokyo, Imperial headquarters faced a grim choice: commit even more resources to Guadalcanal, or accept defeat and withdraw. The decision would have strategic implications across the Pacific. Meanwhile, surviving Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal retreated deeper into the jungle. Short on food, medicine, and ammunition, disease and starvation began killing more men than American bullets. The island was becoming a death trap, but Japanese military culture made retreat unthinkable. Thousands would die in the coming weeks, not from combat, but from hunger and illness, as their supply lines collapsed under American air and naval pressure. November 13, 1942. Near midnight, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan stood on the bridge of heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, peering into the darkness ahead. Radar operators reported multiple contacts approaching at high speed from the northwest. Callahan knew exactly what this meant. A powerful Japanese force was steaming down the slot, likely including battleships, intent on bombarding Henderson Field into rubble. His orders were simple and terrible: stop them at any cost. What followed would be one of the most chaotic and brutal naval battles in American history. Callahan commanded 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers against Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's force of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 14 destroyers. The Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima mounted 14-inch guns that could devastate Callahan's ships if allowed to operate freely, but battleships were relatively slow and vulnerable in close-quarters night fighting. If Callahan could close the range before the Japanese realized his intent, his smaller ships might have a chance. At 1:48 in the morning on November 13th, the two forces collided in the darkness between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. The range closed to under 3,000 yards point blank for naval combat. Searchlights blazed across the water, illuminating targets. Within seconds, every ship was firing at anything that moved. The battle became a knife fight between steel titans, ships passing so close their crews could see enemy sailors on deck. USS Atlanta, a light cruiser, found herself between opposing forces and was raked by fire from both sides. Admiral Norman Scott, commanding from Atlanta's bridge, was killed instantly when a Japanese shell exploded near him. The cruiser absorbed dozens of hits, her superstructure reduced to twisted metal, fires raging throughout her hull. She would sink the next day, abandoned after damage control efforts failed. Destroyer USS Cushing charged directly at battleship Hiei, firing torpedoes at suicidally close range. Japanese secondary batteries blew Cushing apart, but not before her torpedoes damaged Hiei's steering. The battleship began circling uncontrollably, unable to maintain course. Other American destroyers pressed attacks with equal desperation. USS Laffey closed to within a few dozen yards of Hiei, raking the battleship's superstructure with 5-inch guns before Japanese fire literally blew the destroyer in half. Admiral Callahan's flagship San Francisco engaged Hiei directly, shells from both ships slamming into each other at murderously close range. A Japanese salvo hit San Francisco's bridge, killing Callahan instantly along with most of his staff. The cruiser's captain, Cassin Young, was also killed. Yet San Francisco kept fighting, her surviving officers maintaining fire even as their ship was pounded to scrap. The battle lasted only 32 minutes of sustained combat, but the destruction was catastrophic. When dawn broke, both fleets had withdrawn to assess damage. The Americans had lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers sunk, with every surviving ship damaged. 700 American sailors died in the darkness, but the Japanese had also suffered severely. Hiei was so badly damaged that American aircraft from Henderson Field found and sank her the next day. It was the first Japanese battleship lost in World War II. According to historical analysis from the Naval War College, the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal demonstrated that American commanders had learned to accept casualties in exchange for tactical objectives, a crucial psychological shift from earlier defensive operations. Callahan's sacrifice of his force saved Henderson Field from bombardment and kept American air superiority intact. 2 nights later, November 14th to 15th, the Japanese tried again. Vice Admiral Nobutakado brought a powerful force, including battleship Kirishima, to bombard Henderson Field. This time, Rear Admiral Willis Lee's Task Force 64, built around battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota, intercepted them. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was more controlled, but equally violent. South Dakota suffered electrical failures at the worst possible moment, leaving her blind and vulnerable. Japanese ships illuminated her with searchlights and pounded her with concentrated fire, yet her heavy armor kept her afloat even as she absorbed dozens of hits. Meanwhile, Washington had used the confusion to close undetected. At 7,000 yards medium range for battleships, Washington opened fire on Kirishima with devastating accuracy. Her 16-inch shells tore through the Japanese battleship's armor, starting uncontrollable fires and destroying her steering. Kirishima would sink before dawn. These naval battles were strategically decisive. Japan lost 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 11 transports, and 64 aircraft in 3 days of fighting around Guadalcanal. American losses were severe to cruisers, 7 destroyers but replaceable. More importantly, the Japanese Navy had failed to isolate Guadalcanal or prevent American reinforcement. Control of the sea approaches remained contested. But America's industrial capacity meant more ships arrived monthly, while Japanese losses could not be replaced quickly enough. For the Marines and soldiers on Guadalcanal, the naval victories meant survival. Supplies and reinforcements continued arriving despite Japanese efforts. Henderson Field remained operational, its aircraft continuing to maul Japanese convoys and installations. The campaign was entering its final phase, though few participants realized it yet. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding from 1,000 wounds, but America's greater resources were beginning to tip the balance decisively. December 1st. 1942, General Alexander Vandegrift stood outside his command post watching fresh Army troops disembark from transports. The American Division and the 2nd Marine Division were arriving to relieve his exhausted 1st Marine Division. After 4 months of continuous combat, his Marines were finally going home. They looked like scarecrows, gaunt, hollow-eyed, many weighing 30 or 40 pounds less than when they had landed. Nearly half suffered from malaria. All bore psychological scars that would never fully heal. Major General Alexander Patch assumed command of what was now designated the 14th Corps. His mission was to complete what the Marines had started: clear Guadalcanal entirely of Japanese forces and secure the island as a base for future operations. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced a strategic dilemma. Imperial headquarters had poured 36,000 troops into Guadalcanal, most of whom were now starving in the jungle, cut off from supply, dying from disease and malnutrition. The question was whether to reinforce again or cut losses and withdraw. The answer came on December 31st, when Emperor Hirohito approved Operation Kita, evacuation of Guadalcanal. This decision represented Japan's first acknowledgement of strategic defeat in World War II, but Japanese commanders would not admit retreat publicly. They disguised the evacuation preparations as another reinforcement operation, even running empty transports down the slot to maintain deception. The actual evacuation would use destroyers that could outrun American pursuit. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops began receiving mysterious orders to concentrate at Cape Esperance on the island's northwestern tip. Many soldiers, sick and starving, barely had strength to make the trek. They staggered through jungle they had come to hate, knowing they were abandoning comrades too sick to move. Some units left behind their wounded with supplies and apologies, promising rescue that would never come. It was an army in defeat, though officers still forbade use of that word. General Patch, unaware of Japanese intentions, planned an offensive to push west from the Matanico River and crush remaining enemy forces. On January 10, 1943, American forces attacked in strength, expecting fierce resistance. Instead, they found abandoned positions, discarded equipment, and evidence of hasty withdrawal. Japanese rearguards fought skillfully, delaying American advances to cover the evacuation, but the main force was gone. Between February 1st and 7th, 1943, Japanese destroyers executed Operation K with remarkable efficiency. They evacuated 10,652 soldiers from Cape Esperance in 3 separate runs, conducting the evacuation under American noses with minimal losses. It was a masterpiece of planning and execution, one of the few bright spots in Japan's Guadalcanal experience. But it was still a retreat from the first territory Japan had been forced to abandon since beginning its Pacific expansion. On February 9th, 1943, General Patch sent his historic message to Admiral Halsey: total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal effected today. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The 6-month campaign was over. American forces had secured their first major ground victory against Japan, establishing a template for future operations throughout the Pacific. The costs had been staggering for both sides. American casualties totaled 7,100, including 1,600 killed. The Navy lost 24 warships and dozens more damaged. Marine and Army aircraft losses exceeded 400. The emotional and psychological toll defied easy calculation. Every veteran carried memories that would haunt them for decades. The smell of rotting corpses in tropical heat, the screams of wounded men, the faces of friends killed beside them. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Approximately 31,000 soldiers had been sent to Guadalcanal. 19,000 died there, most from starvation and disease rather than combat. The Navy lost 24 warships, including 2 battleships and 4 cruisers. Aircraft losses exceeded 800 planes with irreplaceable veteran pilots. Strategically, Japan had been forced onto the defensive for the first time. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Guadalcanal also revealed crucial lessons about Pacific warfare. Logistics mattered more than fighting spirit. Air superiority was decisive. Henderson Field had been the key to American victory. Naval control enabled ground operations but required accepting casualties and fighting aggressively. Perhaps most importantly, American troops could match Japanese forces in combat effectiveness when properly led and supported. The learning curve had been steep and bloody, but American forces emerged as competent jungle fighters, capable of offensive operations. For the young men who fought there, Guadalcanal remained the defining experience of their lives. They had been tested at the absolute limits of human endurance and had not broken. Marine Private Robert Leckie, who would later write powerfully about his experiences, captured the feeling. We had done what had to be done. We had held that goddamned worthless island when everyone said it couldn't be held. We had won. That sense of having achieved something historically important, having turned the tide in humanity's largest war, would sustain veterans through decades of nightmares and survivors' guilt. The jungle reclaimed Guadalcanal quickly after the fighting ended. Vines crawled over abandoned bunkers, rust consumed discarded weapons, and tropical rains washed away bloodstains that had soaked the earth. But the island's strategic importance endured. Henderson Field, renamed and expanded, became a major Allied airbase supporting operations throughout the Solomons. The island that had nearly been America's greatest defeat in the Pacific became instead a launching point for the long road to Tokyo. The Guadalcanal campaign fundamentally changed how both sides prosecuted the Pacific War. For America, it proved that Japan could be defeated through sustained pressure and superior logistics. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, recognized that America's industrial capacity, if properly mobilized, could overwhelm Japan through attrition. The strategy that emerged island-hopping through the Pacific, establishing air bases to support the next advance, grinding down Japanese forces through superior firepower, originated from lessons learned on Guadalcanal. American military leadership underwent dramatic transformation. Commanders who proved too cautious were replaced by aggressive fighters like Halsey, who understood that defeating Japan required accepting casualties and taking calculated risks. Junior officers who demonstrated tactical competence rose rapidly through ranks depleted by combat losses. The Marine Corps, in particular, emerged from Guadalcanal with enhanced prestige and growing confidence in amphibious warfare doctrine that would dominate Pacific operations. For Japan, Guadalcanal represented strategic disaster compounded by institutional failure to adapt. Japanese military culture emphasized offensive spirit over defensive preparation, leading to repeated frontal assaults against prepared positions. Supply and logistics received insufficient attention, resulting in thousands of soldiers starving despite Japan's theoretical control of the seas. Most critically, Japan's inability to replace experienced pilots and ships meant every loss weakened capabilities that could not be restored. The Tokyo Express operations, while tactically impressive, could not compensate for America's growing air superiority. Henderson Field's aircraft sank or damaged enough Japanese ships that reinforcement became prohibitively expensive. Japan's naval aviation never recovered from carrier losses at Midway and Santa Cruz. By 1943, American carrier forces dominated the Pacific, enabling amphibious operations that progressively isolated Japanese garrisons. Individual veterans carried Guadalcanal's legacy in deeply personal ways. Thousands suffered lifelong effects of malaria contracted in the island's swamps. Many experienced what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, waking from nightmares decades after the last shots were fired. Survivors formed associations and gathered periodically to remember fallen comrades. Maintaining bonds forged in combat that civilian life could never replicate, the campaign produced 23 Medal of Honor recipients, more than any other campaign of comparable size. These awards recognized extraordinary valor, but also symbolized the collective sacrifice of thousands who fought with equal courage. Every rifleman who held his position during banzai charges, every pilot who flew despite exhaustion, Every sailor who remained at his station as his ship sank. These men won Guadalcanal through accumulated acts of courage that defied easy description. Strategically, Guadalcanal marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of Allied offensive operations that would continue until Japan's surrender in August 1945. The campaign demonstrated that Pacific War would be decided not by tactical brilliance or warrior ethos, but by industrial capacity and logistical sustainability. America possessed both in overwhelming abundance. Japan possessed neither. Modern historians recognize Guadalcanal as one of World War II's decisive campaigns, comparable to Stalingrad or El Alamein in strategic importance. Military academies worldwide study the campaign's lessons about combined arms coordination, logistics under fire, and leadership in desperate circumstances. The naval battles around Guadalcanal revolutionized understanding of carrier warfare, amphibious operations, and night surface combat. The island itself remains largely undeveloped. A tropical backwater where rusting military equipment still emerges periodically from jungle undergrowth. Iron Bottom Sound, where dozens of warships rest in deep water, has become one of the world's most significant maritime graveyards. Divers explore wrecks where sailors died fighting for control of an island most Americans couldn't locate on a map when the campaign began. For the generation that fought World War II, Guadalcanal represented vindication of democracy against fascist aggression. The young men who landed on that hostile shore in August 1942 stopped Japan's advance and began the liberation of the Pacific. They proved that free citizens fighting for their country's survival could match and defeat professional warriors indoctrinated in militarism. That achievement, purchased with blood and sacrifice in a fetid jungle half a world from home, helped secure the future of the democratic world. The Battle of Guadalcanal was America's first major ground victory against Japan in World War II, but its importance transcended military achievement. It represented a coming of age for American forces in the Pacific, a transformation from defensive desperation to offensive capability. The Marines and soldiers who held Henderson Field against overwhelming odds demonstrated that America possessed not just industrial might, but the fighting spirit to prevail in the century's defining conflict. Their victory on that miserable jungle island lit the path to Tokyo Bay, an ultimate victory.